Good morning, Dr. Amersdorfer. It's a great pleasure for me to have an opportunity to ask you today a couple of questions concerning biobanking process and the biobank. But before that, let me say a few words about you. Let me introduce you. So, Dr. Amersdorfer, you are an international manager with more than 20 years of rich experience in the field of life science industries and in-depth knowledge for the life cycle management of diagnostic and antibody-based products. You have also a proven track record of evaluating and developing innovative products and services derived from breakthrough technology platforms. And in addition to all these activities mentioned, you are also a business mentor, providing strategic advice to startup companies in the areas of business planning, financing, and partnering with the third parties, which is also an important role you have here at the Biobank in Martine. And last but not least, you were also one of the core participants in the foundation of one of the biggest world biobanks in Graz in 2006. So after introducing you, let me ask you first question. What is a biobank and what's the main function of biobanking in general?
Well, thank you for this kind introduction and thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure talking about the Biobank project in Martine. And a biobank in general, I compare it always like a library of books. It's a well-systematic collection of individuals, in this case authors, books, equivalent to biological samples, which gives a great knowledge of content. It's like a storytelling. When you look at an author, when he describes what he thinks, a tissue describes the status of the health of a patient. And a biobank is in general a collection, an archive of well-described samples and data, medical data.
And what samples can be stored in the bank and what are these samples used for?
In general speaking, we decide on the status of the health given the tissue samples or the blood samples of a patient. We distinguish between two types of biobanks. One is a population-based biobank, where we collect the status of the health population and we genetically profile the conditions of donors, versus a diseased population-based biobank where we collect a various collection of diseases in the population. It's kind of the mirror of the status of the health of a nation, okay? And we typically collect all kinds of specimens. It could be from a patient who checks in from the suspicion of having cancer, taking a biopsy of a liver, of a breast, of any type of organ, to define the status of this patient and to understand the mechanism behind this disease. We collect blood. We collect all other specimens like urine, liquor, hair, DNA samples. So we collect basically the whole picture of a human body, if possible, equivalent to any other biobanks established in the world, like for animals, for plants, for virology, biology, systematic analysis, and that is needed to understand how diseases develop.
And how do these samples get to this biobank?
Sure. First line of we're talking here in Martine about a project where we collect a disease-focused biobank. So when a patient checks into the hospital, typically, the doctor will ask him about, do you want to participate in the biobank? Would you like to donate a sample? Voluntarily, typically. And you sign a patient consent form where you approve, so to speak, the research application, where you give a sample, you donate a sample to the biobank.
And we have a variety of samples, as you mentioned, and are all these stored in the same way?
It depends on the sample. So typically when we go back to the archive, to our book collection, samples, tissue samples are usually stored in formalin fixed state. So that there's like a tissue block. You can store at room temperature for indefinite time. I've been working with pathology institutions around the world where we had used tissue samples which are maybe 20, 30 years old. It's very similar to the collection of a bookshelf where you have kind of systematically collected those tissue blocks which are about 1 by 2 centimeters. So you can stack up millions of blocks typically if you have the capacity. And when you look at blood samples, we store them typically in -20, -80 degrees. And the more precious samples, like cryo samples or cell lines, we typically store at -196 in liquid nitrogen. So they're preserved indefinitely. And we can always go back into these systems. When there's a research question, we go into these liquid nitrogen tanks and take out a sample, thaw it, and then perform the research, what you plan to do.
And what happens to these samples once they are stored in this way, as you have just described?
We have certain hypotheses driven by scientists, by researchers in academia, in industries, by all kinds of stakeholders. And they will come to the biobank with a very defined question they have in mind. And the most pressing questions, I'm coming from oncology, the holy grail is how to detect cancer very early on. So we want to look at tissue, blood samples to understand the signature of a cancer patient when it progresses into various stages and how we can catch him very early on. Okay?
Yes, and so we now have a picture of what a sample is, but
Sure.
Now let's talk about the biobank as a building. What does it look like? Does it consist of any special devices or technologies?
Okay.
So can you tell us more about this?
Sure. A biobank is typically set up within the context of a research laboratory. So it doesn't differ very much. If you look at typical biobanks, you have a laboratory with certain biosafety level standards. You have a bench, you have certain equipment, centrifuges, you have a laminar flow where you can work in sterile conditions. You have freezers, you have -80 freezers, -20 freezers, 4 degrees freezers, refrigerators, sorry. And in particular for Martin, we have planned to have a more robotic assisted system where we store blood samples in -80, which is completely hands-off. It's a robotic system where you can type in what type of samples you want to retrieve under -80 conditions. Until it's thawed, you will have a complete control over the storage conditions, which is state-of-the-art. We have planned for Martin as well for the biobank, which is being established currently and will be finalized by Q2 2023. We have a formalin fixed archive, a semi-automatic archive. So you can see where we're going with this. We want to control the archival process. We want to make sure that we don't make mistakes, as these patient samples are very precious. And we want to control the overall state of these samples so that they have good quality, high standards. And we follow the procedures established in the laboratory typically, which we call SOPs, standard operational procedures, so that we are confident with the material we work with, and we give everybody a chance to work with very similar conditions. We want to kind of reduce the variability inherent to a tissue sample or blood sample.
Okay.
And that's kind of the challenge, as well as, I would say, the opportunity for our researchers here at the Esenius Medical Faculty in the greater context of all the researchers in Slovakia, that we want to be kind of a light project to establish a solid biobanking strategy composing of well-thought strategies on collecting material, archiving these, and was associated with the medical data, of course, to give a chance to everybody to work with, I would say, good quality specimens.
And let me ask you one more question. As I have mentioned at the beginning, the Biobank in Graz has been in operation since 2006, so it's possible to speak of a really stable biobanking process. So what, in your opinion, is the biggest benefit of biobanking?
That's a very good question. I would address it in a couple of ways. Biobanking I've been working for the last 25 years in this area, and biobanking has provided researchers and at least at the end also patients and the population a precision medicine approach. Biobanking has been one of the most important contributors for translational medicine. What I mean with this is that we define precise therapies, diagnostic procedures to characterize a patient and to give the right treatment to a patient. To give you an example, 20 years ago or even before that, if you have cancer, you get chemotherapy, you get radiation, we all get treated the same way. With the start of the biobanking operation, kind of going similar in the 80s with the computer technologies, where we kind of capture all the information systematically, electronically, we were able then to develop ideas on how to develop therapies for a given patient by looking at the molecular signature, by looking at specific tumor markers. And if you have, for example, a HER2 expression, positive signature, or for prostate cancer, let's say PCA3, one of these most prominent markers, you will get a specific tailored therapy. So you have a higher chance of responding to the therapy, and you have a better benefit as a patient. I think this is one of the most crucial benefits of a biobank operation, to allow doctors and patients giving a greater chance for better treatment, for earlier diagnosis. In the context, and there's many different stakeholders, so to speak, in biobanking, for the, I would say, for the patients itself, once they donate samples, they will also give the children, their family, the population itself a chance to develop cures for better treatment.
So it's like individually targeted.
Correct. Biobanking is also the umbrella, a framework, which is important to connect scientists within Jesenius, within Martin, in the greater context within Slovakia and across Europe. Just to mention, we have on overall, we have about 600 biobanks in Europe. 600. We have about 100 million samples stored in these archives. And we all need to work together to solve the most imminent problems we face by having infectious diseases like COVID, having cancer, and all kinds of diseases we're getting exposed to, that we all work together as a team, as a group. And biobanking shares information. It shares also the samples, the biosamples, so you have greater impact on the I would say, relevance of different cohorts to analyze the disease, the progression of such diseases, and it gives a chance to all the researchers not to work as an individual, but as a team, to get funded, to also have a greater impact on everybody's life. Okay?
So, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure for me to meet you, and thank you for your time and very interesting and compelling information you've provided. So thank you.
Thank you.